So we're already at the point where our knight can take swings at the player, but there's no hit collider to actually damage the player. You'll remember that we already made it so that our characters will die after 2.5 seconds, so we should go ahead and undo that so that we can actually properly set up damaging through an attack. So let's go back into the Damageable script real quick, and I'm going to remove that call to the hit function on update so that we're not just damaging for no reason. So since we already have the attack state set up for the knight enemy, I think we should start with the knight, and then we'll add similar components to the player so that we can have a sword swing attack for our player, of course. So let's jump into the prefab for the knight enemy. We already have a detection zone for finding where the player is at, but let's create another child game object for the sword attack area. So I'm going to right click on knight enemy in the prefab, create empty, and I guess we can call it sword attack. So next I'm going to go to the animation tab, and I'm going to change to knight attack. And then let's find the frame of animation where we think the sword should be hitting the player. So I would say right here makes a lot of sense. So for this frame, and maybe the two in front of it, we'll make it so that we enable a trigger collider that will allow us to attack the player, calling the hit function on the damageable component. So for that to work, let's keep the animator at this point, and let's do add component, and you need some type of collider 2D. So if you want to keep things super simple, you can stick to a box collider. As an alternative, you could use a polygon collider and kind of match the shape of the sword swing a little bit. So if I do polygon collider here, you'll see that this gives us a 5-point polygon. If we edit polygon, we can move each of these points over to the right and kind of match the shape of our sword swing visuals. Of course, it doesn't need to be perfect, and we're just kind of going for an approximate shape here. So it defaulted to 5 points, but we can add another point just by clicking somewhere halfway between the line, press and hold, and then drag it out to the location you want that point to be. So the shape is very flexible here. Technically, I think the trade-off is that these polygon colliders aren't as performant in the game as a simple box collider would be. For a 2D game, I can't imagine that would have a problem when you only have a few enemies doing this. So I think in these circumstances, it's totally fine to use a polygon collider if you want a more custom shape for your sword hit. So when you're satisfied with your sword collision shape, we can just turn off Edit Collider in the inspector. And the next thing we definitely want to do is take isTrigger and turn that on. While we're at it, I'm also going to take another look at the detection zone box. So the knight can swing all the way over here. So I think it makes sense to edit the collider here and increase the shape of its detection zone. So basically, whenever the player is roughly within range of a sword swing, it'll try to make the attack as well. So we can test it with this shape for the detection zone. So next we want to go to the animation tab, and we're going to want to add a property for the animation. So that's going to be add property, sword attack, polygon collider, enabled. So what we can do is when we want this region to cause damage to a player or any other target, we enable it, and at other times we would disable it. So go to frame 0 on the attack where the sword swing hasn't been made yet, and uncheck enabled on the sword attack polygon collider. Then we'll go here to 2 frames in where we have this part of the animation, and I'm going to enable it since this should be a collidable part of the animation. So if the player's inside of here at this point in time, it's going to get hit. And we'll keep that going, let's say, until right here on this frame, unchecking that. And then on the final frame, we'll also uncheck it. So frame 1, 2, it's not enabled. Then 3, 4, 5, it's enabled where it can deal damage. 6 and 7, it's unable to deal damage. And I'm talking about the sample frames, not the moment in time when we actually change the animation sprite. So now we need to create a new component where when the polygon collider picks up a target, and that target is damageable, we'll hit the target and deal damage to it, and possibly a knockback later as well. So let's add a new component, and I am going to call this attack. So this will be a new script. I'll create an add, and then let's edit it. So of course, the thing we definitely need to get reference to is the collider 2D. So the collider in our attack script, of course, we're going to want to reference this polygon collider. Because this sword attack is its own separate game object, it's only going to have one collider here. We could just get away with grabbing the component that is attached to the game object. So I will do void awake and then do attack collider equals get collider. So because this is a parent class for different types of colliders, it will work for finding the polygon collider as long as the collider attached to this is a type of collider 2D it'll qualify. So a polygon collider 2D or a box collider 2D will work just fine. So inside of our attack script, we're going to need to do a void on trigger enter 2D. And then when an object enters the collider, that means that the collider is enabled and ready to hit a target. So we're going to want to see if the target is valid to be hit. So in our game, we're going to check if the collider 2D of the collision has the component damageable on it. Since anything that is damageable in our game, whether that's a character, an enemy, an NPC, or whatever, is going to need that damageable component. So I'm going to type in damageable equals collision.getComponent damageable. Now, just as a FYI here, you wouldn't have to necessarily use one specific class or component here. You could use an interface here, and then anything that implements an interface would be able to qualify if you did iDamageable instead of damageable. So that would just be if you wanted to have different implementations of what a damageable component would look like, but it's unnecessary for our game, so we're just using this one specific damageable component, which refers to the damageable.cs. So for a target to be hit, it has to be damageable. So we'll check if damageable does not equal null, then we're going to hit the target. So that means we're going to call damageable.hit, and we're going to pass in a damage amount. So I'll call this attack damage. And then let's implement this field at the top of our script. So generate field, attack damage. I'll default this to 10. And I would say we could make this public so that other scripts can reference how much damage it's supposed to deal. And also we'll be able to set it in the inspector when it's public by default. So we don't need a start or an update method. And as for the invincibility part of the damageable component, let's go take a look at the definition for hit. And we can see that when we pass the hit into this function, it's already checking if it's alive or invincible. So we don't need to check on the attack if the state is ready for the character to actually take damage. We're just going to try to damage it and let the logic be determined over on the damageable script side of things. Okay, so let's go back out to the game. Another thing we need to be aware of is that it needs to have the layer enemy hitbox, because we're using the sword attack to damage a player. So we want to check for physics layers that the enemy hitbox would be considered acceptable to hit. And in the case of our game, that's going to be exclusively player objects or colliders that have the player layer attached to it. So let's go to Edit Project Settings, check our Physics 2D, and make sure that on enemy hitbox, and we can see that the enemy hitbox, we've already set it up so that it can only hit players. So let's actually do the same thing in advance for player hitbox. So I'm going to uncheck everything except enemy. So a player can only hit things that are on the enemy layer. So now we have the filter that if something does fall into the trigger zone for the polygon collider of this attack, that A, it's at the frames where the polygon collider is enabled, and B, it's already going to be on the player layer. So basically, we're already certain that whatever the damageable component is attached to a player game object. Now we do want to make sure that our polygon collider is turned off by default, so I'm going to uncheck polygon collider. We only want to enable this when the game is running and the animation of the attack plays, which, if we recall, on night attack is already going to set the collider to active when it's on this frame and persist until this frame. After that, it turns off. So the last thing in the attack script for right now, I'm going to debug log and say collision.name hit for, let's see, attack damage. Attack damage the field. So that'll just give us a little indication that the character took some damage. So let's go ahead and hit play, walk into the attack and see, hey look, we're taking damage. And we can also go click on the player. Let's take a look at its health on the damageable. Okay, so down here we can see health is set to 30. The attack of the knight is kind of missing right there. So maybe we want to expand how far the knight can hit you. But yeah, we definitely got hit 9 times. One more hit and we shouldn't be alive. But unfortunately, our knight kind of went off the screen. Oh no, he actually ended up down there. Interesting. So let's open up the knight enemy, the sword attack polygon collider. Go to the animation, knight attack, and I'm just going to expand it a little bit for the polygon collider, just making it so that the knight can hit a little bit more areas. So maybe we don't need to make it quite that big, but just work with the shape and kind of adjust it until it makes sense for the actual game. Okay, and just remember to turn off polygon collider there. Let's hit play, and we can see we're getting hit. If we're about right here, character still gets hit, taking damage. We can click on the player, scroll down to the bottom, and we can see, yeah, we're taking damage still. So let's get hit that last time, and you can see we transition into the death state. So before we run our game again, we're going to want to make sure that we turn off the Polygon Collider 2D. So this should be disabled by default, and we should also do that on the prefab, making sure that the sword attack is disabled here. So when we hit play, we should still see that the Polygon Collider is disabled. And then that will stop us from accidentally dealing damage when the sword attack technically hasn't even been made yet. So I'm going to re-enable the player here, and let's hit play, go to the console, and you can see that the hit doesn't actually occur until we take damage there. So if we watch the pattern of the knight, we can see it goes to the run state on every attack just for a second before it transitions back to doing the sword swing. So if you like it, taking this little jump where the velocity is there for a second and it actually moves forward on every attack, you can leave it alone. So if you prefer for the knight not to jump back to the move automatically, what we can do is go to the attack state. And then here for the exit, we're only going to leave on the condition that has target is false. So if we wanted to do it this way where it can just keep attacking and stay in this state, then we would want to re-enable looping on knight attack. So let's go find the enemy, knight attack, enable looping, hit play. And now we can see that we're just going to stay in this state. So it'll still be able to swing multiple times, but it's not going to go back out to a running state until our character leaves that area. So obviously this kind of just depends on what you prefer. Obviously, having a sliding motion on every attack can be kind of a cool feature. But maybe it just makes sense to keep them in the same place every time. So up to you. Now I do see that the player is still able to be hit after it's already in the death state. So I'm going to make sure that on the Damageable script that we actually set is alive to false when the health drops below 0. So let's take a look at the Damageable script. We can see if health is less than 0, then we're going to set is alive to false. Let's set a debug point here, attach it to Unity, and we'll see if we can actually get that point to hit. So I'll hit play. Oh, actually, let's make it quicker. I'm going to change the character's health to 10 so that we'll drop to 0 on the first hit. Now let's hit play and see if we hit that debug point. Okay, we do. So let's jump into this a little bit. I'll hit step into. And then, of course, we get to the property here. Is alive equals value. So the value is false. So after this line, is alive should be false as well. So let's check this dot is alive is set to false. And then we set the value on the animator as well. So it seems like the issue is that the health can hit -10. And I'm going to go up here to where is health is less than 0. So technically that's working as written. It should be less than or equal to 0. So 0 still counts as a death state. So when the health drops to 0, we want to set is alive to false. Also, the reason it keeps putting the debug message after the character's dead is because this message runs whether the hit was successful or not. So what we could actually do is go into the hit function and let's have a return type. So bool, hit, and if we get to this part, we're going to return true, as in the Damageable was able to be hit. Otherwise, we return false because it was unable to be hit. So we're returning whether the Damageable took damage or not. And that could mean over here, we could put bool got hit, and we'll only actually debug if the hit was successful. So if got hit, then we debug log for the attack damage. Okay, so now it should be a little bit more clearer when our game's running what happens. So I'll hit play, and we get hit once, and after that, we don't get hit anymore. So you can see is alive was set to false. If we click on our player, the health that we get stuck at is 0. Once the character is in that state, it's unable to be hit any more times. So that just cleans that up for us. We can now go ahead and reset the health back to the default of 100. So another thing that would make our attack more interesting is if there was some kind of knockback effect on the attack. So let's edit the attack script again. And I'll go up here to the top and let's add in a public vector2 knockback. And this would default to vector2.0. So not every attack would have a knockback. And what we want to do is when a character gets hit, we also want to pass in the knockback vector. So this is going to mean that we need to add the parameter to damageable.hit. So let's go to the definition. I'll do vector2 here, knockback. Now, the way that a knockback is going to affect our characters may depend on the exact way we script the character's movement. Because it's more of a physics function, I don't want to have it change the rigid body values on the damageable component itself. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to pass the knockback vector and the damage to other components that exist on our enemy or player game objects by using a Unity event. So at the top of our damageable script, I'm going to put a public Unity event, and I'm going to control period using Unity engine.events. And we want to give it the types of the parameters that we're going to pass in to any method that is called when the Unity event is invoked. So it's going to be an int for damage and a vector2 for the knockback. And I'll call the event Damageable Hit. So down here on the hit function, I want to call Damageable Hit. So let's see, Damageable Hit. I spelled that right. Let me copy that up to the top. Yeah, okay, I forgot the E. So Damageable Hit is the Unity event name. And then I want to do .invoke. And we're going to invoke with the damage and the knockback. So any functions that are subscribed to the Unity event are going to invoke the methods using these as the parameters when our character gets hit. So when the character gets hit, basically, other components like the player script can respond to it and apply the knockback to the rigid body. But I do want to make sure that the subscriber list is not null. If you try to invoke a event that has no subscribers, I think you get an error message. Because if nothing is responding to it, then it's unneeded anyway. So to make sure that the list is not null, we add a question mark there. So we check if it's null or not null. And if there is something in the list for the events to invoke, then we invoke. We pass in the damage, we pass in the knockback, and then those functions are going to get called on other scripts. So in order for this to work, we need another component that is going to have a function to respond to this. So I'll create an OnHit function on the player controller. So let's go to the player controller down to the bottom, I suppose. So let's add in public void OnHit. This is going to take int damage and vector2 knockback. And we'll do something with this information in a minute. So to set up the Unity event, let's go back out to the game. I'm going to expand the player prefab, and let's scroll down to our damageable component. And we can minimize the ones that are necessary. So you can see here, Damageable now has this box here where it says Damageable Hit, list is empty. This should look familiar because it's just like the player import where you have events. So you can see the player input events move with a callback context. It's the same idea. Those are Unity events here. So we just created a Unity event in our custom script. So now I need a function to call when the Damageable Hit is invoked. So let's hit play. I'm going to drag the player game object from the prefab over here. Let's click on the drop-down list. So we want player controller, OnHit, dynamic int vector2. So when this component is hit, this player controller is going to respond to it by calling the OnHit function with the data that just got passed in. So when we reach OnHit with the damage and the knockback, what I'm going to want to do is take the velocity of the character, and I'm going to set the x velocity to whatever the knockback is. So this is going to be equal to a new vector2, and let's do knockback.x. But for the y movement, at least for now, I want to maintain whatever velocity already existed and then add the knockback to it. So that's going to be rb.velocity.y plus knockback.y. So the other thing we're going to want to do when the character gets hit is make sure that we transition into the hit state. So we could set that up on the player controller, but I think I actually want to do it on the damageable component this time around, since different characters that are damageable are going to probably have hit animations as well. So for damageable, when we get hit, I'm going to do IsHit equals true. So this is going to be a property we're going to generate up at the top. I'm going to right click, go to the definition. And for right now, I'm just going to focus on getting the value from the animator and setting it on the animator. So get is going to be animator.getBool, and we'll do animation strings.isHit, which we haven't created, of course, and we're going to return that. So let's generate the field and go to the definition. I will make it equals IsHit. And then for the setter, it's very similar, of course. We're just going to do animator.setBool animation strings IsHit equals the value we passed into the setter. And then on the flip side, when we exit the animation state, we'll just use the SetBoolBehaviour for the state machine to turn IsHit off, and then that will let the damageable component know that it's no longer hit. So on the player controller, we need to limit the movement for fixed update. So right now, the fixed update X movement is being overwritten by whatever the movement speed would be based on the player's input. But when we specifically get hit with a knockback, we want that knockback stun, where the character is just going to progress in a certain direction and it doesn't matter what input we have. So we want to check if the damageable component is hit currently, and then if that's the case, we disable our movement updates. So the direct way to do this is going to be to add the damageable component to our player controller. So I'll do damageable, and then on awake, I'll get the damageable component. So damageable equals get component damageable. And then on fixed update, we'll see if the damageable component recognizes that the character is hit. So if, and we're going to have an exclamation mark to reverse this, but damageable.isHit. So we want to check that this is false. And only when this is false can we set the RB velocity. So whenever the character is hit, we can't update the velocity based on our input. And right now our player controller is dependent on the damageable script. So I am going to add it to the required components up here at the top. So type of damageable. And make sure you have the ending parenthesis there. Okay, so now we need to add this parameter to the animator. So let's go back out with the player animator. Let's add the Boolean here, IsHit. While we're at it, we can also add it to the night enemy. So I'm going to click on night, add the Boolean. So having the night enemy set up with IsHit will eventually allow us to transition into the hit animation as well. So now let's update the player animations. So now we need to add the hit animation for the player. So let's go to the animation window with the player selected, and let's create the player hit animation. Set the samples to 10. Let's go to project, RV Ross individual sprites, and let's find adventurer.hit. And let's find adventurer hurt 0 through 2 and put those in the window here, hit play. So we're only going to have this animation play once. So let's turn off looping for it in the characters player folder. So we need to find it in our project. I can't find it. I must have put it in the wrong folder. So I'm going to search player hit, and let's drag this animation into the player folder. So now if we give it the search term, and we can make sure it's in there. Let's click on player hit, go to the inspector, turn off loop. So now if we click on player, we hit, let's see, player hit, play. Okay, so now that we have this animation, let's go to the animator. So with our player hit animation on the animator, we're going to want to be able to transition to it from any state. So I'm going to make a transition to player hit. The requirement for this is going to be IsHit is true, but I'll also add in IsAlive is true as well, because if it's not alive, then we want to go specifically to player death. So for this transition duration 0, so it should happen instantly. And when we're in this state, we want 2 copies of the SetBoolBehaviour. So one is going to set can move, update on state, then the value on enter is going to be false, value on exit is true. But in addition to that, I want to click add behavior, set bool, and we're going to set IsHit to false when we're leaving the state. So IsHit, update on state, value on exit is false, value on enter is true. So when we're done being hit, we want to return to either the air states or the ground states, depending on whether is grounded is true or false. So I'll right click on player hit, make a transition to the state machine air states. The condition for this will be that is grounded is false, has exit time true, the exit time is 1, and the transition duration is 0. So that means at the end of player hit, we just return to the air states. Now on the flip side, if grounded is true, then we'll do the same thing with ground states. So click on the transition here, add the condition, is grounded is true, exit time 1, transition duration 0. And so that sets our return for after we're done being hit. We can move into the air states or the ground states immediately. So let's hit play and try to get hit and see what happens. So we can see that our animation plays, and after that, it kind of gets stuck there. So let's go back to the main scene, make sure the player selected hit play, and then we'll be able to watch the animations. So we get to player hit, but nothing actually really occurs here. It just kind of gets stuck there. So the reason for that is that when we click on the line for the transition, we have to turn off can transition to self. So just like with player death, whenever you make a transition from any state, you got to make sure that you don't check can transition to self. Maybe it would be okay if you were using triggers, but for Booleans like this, no. So now we should not get stuck in player hit. We have the animation play, and then it's not actually exiting. At least it's playing now, though. So I think that this Boolean might be actually causing us some problems. So I'm going to actually change the transition condition here to a trigger. So let's add the trigger, and I'll call the trigger hit. So instead of IsHit, we'll use hit. This trigger will set whenever we get hit in the script. So we'll still have a Boolean value, but I'm going to change this to LockVelocity, and we'll rename this parameter to LockVelocity. So this is going to mean that we can't change the velocity. So let's go update our scripts to use this. So at the bottom of the Damageable and the hit function, let's do, instead of IsHit equals true, animator.setTrigger animation strings.hit, and then we'll create that as a trigger name. So let's go to the definition. We can actually make this a hit trigger. So I want to be kind of more clear about that. So I'm going to rename this to hit trigger, right click and rename so that it updates in all the files. And we'll call the string for it hit though. Okay, so we're setting the hit trigger, which will allow the transition to happen. So we're not actually going to need this IsHit. And as a result, on the player controller, let's just remove the reference to the damageable component. Let's remove the require type of damageable. We'll remove the get component damageable. And then let's create a new property. So LockVelocity is not set to true. Let's generate that property. Go to definition. And this will only have a get function for right now. So the get function is going to be animator.getBool animation strings.LockVelocity. So we need to generate that, and we'll give it the string name in here, LockVelocity. And we need to have a return for this. Okay, so this is kind of nice because now our player controller is not directly dependent on the damageable component, but rather this parameter is just being set in the animation states. Okay, so let's go ahead and see if it works now. I'll hit play. We'll get hit, and you can see that we're not moving here. LockVelocity is not being set to false on exit though. So I actually see that the SetBoolBehaviour, the value on exit, is not setting properly. So let's go edit the script. And here's our problem on state exit. I actually mean to have value on exit here. So that's really the root of the problem there. If we hit play, then we can get hit. Okay, and now you can see that after the hit's done, our settings are returning back to where they should be. So changing to this LockVelocity option, probably not entirely necessary. Otherwise it would have worked, but I think that this implementation is actually better. So that's going to be what I'm going to keep as we go forward in this tutorial. So now after all of that, we want to make the attack actually have a knockback. So let's go to the knight enemy, the sword attack. Let's jump into the prefab. And you can see we have the field for knockback. So we need an X value and a Y value. So this is going to be in velocity per second. So if we put 5, that means 5 units per second. And we can add a Y velocity as well. So let's try 5 on the X and 2 on the Y. Let's hit play. Let's go get hit. And you can see that our character is getting hit. Now we're actually getting hit multiple times. Now we're actually able to get hit multiple times here. So a quick fix for that would be to go back out to the player and increase the invincibility time. So let's go to the player invincibility time and let's set that to 0.5 seconds on the prefab. Hit play. Okay, now we should only get hit once for each time. So another way we might want to make sure that the player doesn't get hit multiple times. So we could just keep increasing the invincibility time of the player. So we might even want the invincibility time to be something like 1. So let's get hit. And okay, yeah, that's better. We're definitely only getting hit 1 time by the sword. You could also make it so that the sword only hits on a single frame and then it will never hit more than once per attack. But it's something you just got to kind of play around with. So let's apply that to the prefab player. But we can see that even though there is a knockback, that our speed is not being completely controlled by the knockback. We can still kind of manipulate it, which probably isn't what we want either. So maybe to make absolutely sure that this velocity doesn't get changed until the hit is done, we'll also do a LockVelocity equals true inside of the player controller itself. So that's going to mean setter function animator.setBool animation strings.LockVelocity equals the value. And so that should mean even before we get to the hit state that this should already be set to true, which means that the RB velocity shouldn't run. So let's see if that actually fixes our problem there. So we hit play. Let's get hit. I'm going to try moving. Okay. And now it's actually working correctly. So I guess there was just a split frame before the hit animation starts that value was not set to true. Okay, so now we're definitely not able to move whenever we get hit. So to kind of wrap up this video, we should add an attack to the player as well. So let's click on player. I'm going to jump in here. Let's create a new game object. So this is going to be the sword attack. I'm going to add a collider in here. So let's do a polygon collider, just like the knight. And I'll add in the attack script. So the knockback here, we could say 3 and then 1 to give it a little bit of a bump into the Y direction. The attack damage, let's say 15 by default. So we need to add this collider to the animation. So animation, let's do player attack 1, add property, sword attack. Let's do polygon collider enabled. So at the start of the animation here, it's not enabled, of course. And right here is where we want to enable the collider. We'll just have it at that single frame, so the next frame after we disable it again. And then the last frame, it's disabled. So it's just a 1 frame hit here for this sword swing. And let's edit the collider. So inspector, edit collider. Okay, and let's make sure we're on the hit frame so that we know where to put the shape. And then take the polygon points and move them to wherever you think would be good for the hitbox of the sword swing. So I'll just kind of click and add a few points here. I think that looks pretty reasonable for this sword arc. And then make sure that the sword attack is off by default for the polygon collider. And I'll check the main object in the main scene. The sword collider, this should be off here as well. So now we're going to need to edit the knight script and create an OnHit to apply the knockback there for the knight as well. So I'm going to add a component here for the knight. So let's open up the knight script for editing. I'll go down here to the bottom and let's create a public void OnHit, which is going to take the damage and the vector2 knockback. For this character, we'll basically take the same code from player controller. So I'm going to have the LockVelocity property and the RB velocity set, and I'm just going to paste those over here. Now that I think about it, though, we're just really duplicating code here. So I think we're going to take the LockVelocity and put it into the Damageable script. So let's go grab the property from the player controller. And we'll kind of go back to a few minutes ago again. So cutting and pasting the LockVelocity. Going to go in here to the Damageable, paste that in. So down here when we get hit on Damageable, I want to set LockVelocity to true. And so that means we do need the reference to the Damageable component in the player controller. So Damageable, Damageable. And we are going to require type of Damageable at the top here. So let's go down to onAwake and get the component, just like we always do, get component Damageable. And so we're not checking LockVelocity, but rather Damageable.LockVelocity in order to determine if we can move here or not. Okay, so this means that on the knight, we can also reference the Damageable component in the same way. So Damageable, Damageable, require type of Damageable. And then we can go down to where we're setting the movement for this character, which should be in fixed update. And we'll add a new if condition. So if Damageable.LockVelocity is not true, so let's add the exclamation mark for that, then we will allow our normal movement logic here. So just paste all of that inside. Otherwise, we're not going to mess with the velocity. So having the LockVelocity and the Damageable means we don't need to rewrite the same code for every other component, but we are going to need to manually respect that lock on the player controller, the knight scripts, to actually make sure that we don't update the rigid body velocity. So when we have this LockVelocity on the Damageable, it's convenient to have here, but because our physics are in other components like the player controller, we need to make sure that we respect that on those individual components. So at the bottom for the OnHit of the knight, we can remove the LockVelocity is true. Going to click to jump to the same thing in the player controller. We remove that here as well. And let's make sure that that error is cleaned up as well. So the type of Damageable is required. And so something we could even think about doing is, if we wanted to, we could just have the RB velocity set on the damageable component directly. For right now, I'm not going to do that because I don't necessarily want the damageable to have to mess with the physics itself. So for now, we're just going to keep using the Unity event to pass that knockback information to a different script. So I'll admit it's an imperfect implementation, but it should work at least for now. So let's add the method to damageable hit on the knight. So I'm going to take the knight script, drag that down there, and let's go to knight on hit so we can apply the velocity to the knight when we get hit. So let's make sure that the parameter lock velocity is also set on the animator component. So parameters, add bool, lock velocity. So that should be on player and the knight as well here. We can delete IsHit because we're not using that anymore. And then add the trigger. So it'll be very similar to the player. From any state, we can make the transition to hit. The conditions for that are going to be that the hit trigger is made, and also that isAlive is true. We're going to turn off can transition to self, transition duration 0. And then from knight hit, at the end of that, we're going to make the transition to move, state machine, move. And this should happen automatically at exit time 1 with a transition duration of 0. Also on knight hit, I'm going to add the SetBoolBehaviour ValueOnExit is going to be false, but on enter is true. And the bool name is LockVelocity. So update on state. We also need to make sure that we actually get the reference to the damageable component in the knight script. Otherwise, it's not going to work, of course. So on awake, do damageable equals get component damageable. Okay, now with all of that, make sure you're in the main scene. Let's open up the animator for the knight. Let's hit play and make sure everything works still. So the knight is able to move. Let's see if we can hit the knight if we get close. So right now it's kind of hard to do that. So right now it's pretty hard to do that, but let's get closer and see if we can hit him. Okay, so what's going on here is that we haven't set up the sword attack properly. So the sword attack is still in layer player, but we want this to be player hitbox. And we also need to take the polygon collider and turn it to isTrigger mode. Now let's try hitting play and see if we can hit again. So we're swinging at the knight. Oh, I do see the knight getting hit. Okay, and we're actually able to kill him. Now the animation for the hit seems to happen almost instantly, and I believe that is because the animation on the knight is a single frame. So we got to go back to knight enemy, open up the animation, and we can see the knight frame here. It's only lasting a single frame. So if we control and middle mouse scroll outwards, we can just copy this frame out to however long we need it to last for. So I'll put it at 0.4, paste it in, and now this animation should last for 0.5 seconds by default. So let's try going into play mode again, hit play, and we should have a 0.5 second knockback for the knight. So let's see if we can hit him. Okay, yep. So definitely hitting him. The knockback may be a little bit wonky there, so we can change the settings on it. So let's go into the sword attacks values for the knockback, and I'll set the Y to 2, and the knockback X, let's actually set that to 2 as well. So one reason for making the velocity set on the knockback custom for each of the characters might be that you can allow each character component, whether that's a knight or a player controller, to be able to take that knockback vector and apply it individually. So if you wanted the knight to be, let's say, more resistant to the knockback, you could just take the X value and cut that in half before you apply it to the velocity. For right now, though, of course, they act the same. So let's try hitting the knight. Okay, and we can see he gets a little pop off the ground there. Maybe that's not what we want. Maybe we want the sword hit to be a little bit softer. So I'll just take the Y and I'll set that to 0, leave the X as 2. Yeah, now the knight gets knocked back a little bit, but not too crazy. So it's mostly working, but we can see that sometimes the sword doesn't actually hit the knight. So that was just a mistake in setting up the sword attack. So if we go to the sword attack, you can see that we set no offset for the transform. So when we're flipping the transform over from over here to the left, we're not actually reversing this polygon collider shape in any way. So we need to make sure that the center for our transform on the sword attack is actually over to the right as well. So it should look something like this. The transform X is, let's say, 1. And then let's jump into animation, attack. go to the frame where we have the attack, and then we need to pull all these points over again, like so. So if we click on player now, and then I do -1 on the scale, then we'll be able to click on the sword attack, and now you'll see that it's properly over here on the left. Got to make sure that your transform is still the center point for your animation over here. So we reverse the direction based on the transform, and that's why we need to set the offset for the sword attack. So we should also make sure that for the knight enemy, we do the same thing. So knight enemy, let's double click on it. Let's look at the attack animation. Go to the frame where we have the attack. I'm going to click on sword attack in the inspector. And we can actually see I made the same mistake over here. So we need to take the offset and move that to the center point of our attack right about there. And then we need to position the polygon collider based on that. So polygon collider over to here, like so, and keep moving the points to fit the sword's attack. And then we'll test it by clicking on knight enemy and doing a -1 on the scale. -1. Now if we click on the sword attack, we'll be able to see that it's over here on the left. So that's what we're looking for. And that should help make sure that the animations actually match the collision shapes for our attacks. So now we can hit play, and I'm going to go swing the sword at him, and you can see it's actually hitting correctly now. So that's what we would expect. And we can also test to make sure that when we get hit by the sword over here, that is being applied as well. One more thing I notice is that the sword is knocking us back to the right no matter what. So what we really should be doing is changing the knockback vector depending on which direction our enemy is facing when they make the attack. So since our characters are based on the local scale changing, let's go into attack. And when we apply the knockback, we want to reverse it if we're facing the left. So let's come up with a final value for a delivered knockback. The final value we're actually passing to the hit target. And that's going to be equal to the transform.parentTransform.localScale.x is greater than 0. And then if that's the case, then we're going to do knockback. Otherwise, we're going to do a new vector2, which is going to be knockback.x, knockback.y. But on the x, we're going to make it negative. So our attacks are a child component of the main character game object. And on the character game object, we're flipping the scale. So as a result of that, if we flip to face the left, then we also flip our knockback to face the left. So I'm going to create a knight enemy down here as well, moving the player down to this little area where we have 2 walls so that we can easily test directions. Let's hit play, and we'll see that from this direction, our knockback does go towards that wall. And on the flip side, our knockbacks are still going towards that wall. And the reason for that is that we haven't used the delivered knockback in the hit. So this is our final knockback value, depending on what direction they're facing. Okay, so let's go ahead and hit play. We get hit from that direction. Okay, that's fine. And then we come over here. And okay, now our knockbacks are actually hitting the right direction. So that should apply both for the enemies, but also for us. So let's see if we can get a knockback from the left as well. Okay, yeah. So the knockback is directional based now. So that's what we're looking for. And that's going to wrap it up for this part on getting hit colliders, attacks, and knockbacks to work for both our player and knight characters.